Imagine being 14 years old and suddenly become the ruler of one of the most powerful empires in the world. You would think that being in charge of such an empire would make you careful, wise, and strategic, right? Well, not for Heliogabalus. In fact, his rule was nothing short chaotic, scandalous, and bizarre. From strange religious practices to lavish, mind-boggling parties and sexual scandals, Heliogabalus turned the Roman Empire upside down during his brief reign. But how did a teenager manage to get his hands on the throne, and why did his reign descend into madness? Stick with me until the end as we unravel the shocking and perverse story of one of Rome's most infamous emperors. The history of the Roman Empire is filled with extraordinary figures, empires forged by mighty generals, wise statesmen, and brilliant strategists. Yet, among all the famous emperors who shaped the destiny of Rome, one name stands out for its sheer absurdity: Heliogabalus. Born in 203 AD, Heliogabalus didn't have a simple or ordinary rise to power. He wasn't born into the imperial family. He wasn't a military genius, nor was he a philosopher or a political strategist. No, Heliogabalus was just a teenager with a bizarre and dangerous thirst for power and excess. He became emperor at the tender age of 14 and ruled for just 4 years. But in those few years, he managed to become one of the most scandalous, perverse, and controversial emperors in Roman history. His reign is often remembered as one of the most chaotic periods in the empire's history, filled with strange rituals, sexual scandal, and bizarre behavior that shocked even the most tolerant Romans. But beyond the scandal, Heliogabalus' rule speaks to the dangers of absolute power in the hands of a reckless ruler. In this video, we'll dive deep into the twisted reign of Heliogabalus and explore how a teenager with no experience or concern for tradition brought the Roman Empire to its knees. The rise of Heliogabalus. To understand Heliogabalus' rise to power, we need to look at the circumstances surrounding his family and the political environment of Rome at the time. Heliogabalus was born as Varius Avitus Bassianus to a Syrian family with close ties to the ancient sun god El-Gabal, whom they worshipped in their homeland. His family wasn't in line to take the throne, but they were part of a complex web of alliances, both in Rome and in the provinces, which would eventually make Heliogabalus emperor. The downfall of Emperor Carus and the subsequent political chaos that followed created an opening for power struggles. Heliogabalus' mother, Julia Simias, played a crucial role in maneuvering her son into the imperial seat. She convinced the Roman soldiers in the Senate that Heliogabalus, being a young and seemingly innocent child, would be the perfect candidate to restore order after the tumultuous reigns of previous emperors. As a result, Heliogabalus was declared emperor in 218 AD at the age of just 14. Though his ascent was politically orchestrated, Heliogabalus quickly grew into a ruler who didn't just follow the script. Rather than respecting the traditions that had been carefully cultivated over centuries, he embraced his power in a way that would defy every expectation. It wasn't long before his eccentricities began to shine through, and he made it clear that he would not rule like any emperor before him. Heliogabalus' early actions as emperor. At first, Heliogabalus' reign seemed promising, at least to those who believed in his potential as a figurehead who could bring stability to the empire. But what they didn't anticipate was his complete disregard for Roman traditions and the gravity of his position. It didn't take long for his true nature to surface, as his first major action as emperor was to introduce a foreign deity into Roman religious life. Heliogabalus' obsession with the sun god El-Gabal, whom he had been raised to worship in his native Syria, became the cornerstone of his early reign. He wasn't satisfied with merely worshiping this god privately. Instead, he brought El-Gabal to the heart of Roman religion. He constructed an enormous temple in Rome, dedicated to El-Gabal, and attempted to replace Jupiter, the king of the Roman gods, with his new deity. The Roman Senate and the people were horrified. To them, this wasn't just a religious blunder, it was sacrilege. The idea that a foreign god could take precedence over Jupiter, the protector of the Roman state, was unthinkable. Heliogabalus, however, was relentless. His insistence on imposing this new religious order on the empire alienated not just the Senate, but also the Roman citizens who found themselves forced to participate in foreign rituals. He even dressed in extravagant robes and conducted the rites, which included dance and sacrifice, with an intensity that many Romans found unsettling. But religious innovation wasn't the only strange thing Heliogabalus was known for. His private life, too, was filled with scandal and perversion that shocked even the more permissive members of Roman society. Heliogabalus' sexuality and scandals. One of the most infamous aspects of Heliogabalus' reign was his sexuality. Heliogabalus didn't follow the expected norms of Roman emperors, many of whom had wives, concubines, and occasionally lovers. Instead, Heliogabalus engaged in behavior that scandalized the Roman world. He was known for his relationships with both men and women, and he often flaunted these relationships in public. In one of the most notorious episodes, Heliogabalus is said to have taken a charioteer named Hierocles as his lover, and the two even participated in a wedding ceremony where Hierocles was treated as the empress of the emperor. But Heliogabalus wasn't just about having lovers. He also had a strange obsession with eunuchs, men who had been castrated. These eunuchs were often given prominent roles at his court and served as attendants in his palace. In fact, Heliogabalus even took to dressing them in women's clothing and treated them as though they were women, making them part of his lavish parties and public displays. These bizarre and perverse acts were meant to shock and to display his power, but they also deeply disturbed the Roman people. To them, this wasn't just unorthodox. It was deeply humiliating. The emperor had alienated not just his people, but also the military and the Senate, who began to see him as an emperor who was out of touch with the reality of Roman power and tradition. The lavish and excessive lifestyle. Beyond his sexual behavior, Heliogabalus was known for his extreme love of luxury. He was obsessed with excess, and his wealth and status were used to indulge every whim, no matter how ridiculous. His banquets became legendary for their extravagance. One of the most outrageous aspects of his parties was the use of animals. Heliogabalus reportedly had animals like lions, leopards, and bears brought into the dining halls, where they would roam freely as guests dined. On one occasion, he even had wild animals released onto guests, causing chaos and fear. But he didn't stop at that. He also had food dropped from the ceilings of banquet halls, with flowers, fruit, and other delicacies falling onto guests, sometimes burying them under a pile of roses. He also lavished gifts on his court and soldiers, showering them with jewels, gold, and even expensive clothes. While such gifts might have helped maintain loyalty in some emperors, they did little to help Heliogabalus. In fact, his obsession with wealth and luxury only increased the disdain that many Romans felt toward him. Heliogabalus' downfall. As Heliogabalus' eccentricities grew, so did the resentment from the Roman people, the Senate, and the military. The Roman soldiers, who were the backbone of the empire, became particularly disillusioned with his reign. Heliogabalus was more interested in throwing lavish feasts and indulging in personal pleasures than focusing on the needs of the empire. The army, which had once supported him as a young emperor, became alienated by his disregard for Roman military traditions and values. The situation grew so dire that in 222 AD, after only 4 years on the throne, Heliogabalus was assassinated by members of his own guard. His mother, Julius Oemias, was also killed in the chaos. The death of Heliogabalus marked the end of a short but notorious reign. The Senate, eager to rid itself of the scandalous emperor, ordered that all references to Heliogabalus be erased from history. Statues of him were destroyed, his name was removed from inscriptions, and all memory of his reign was condemned. It was as if Heliogabalus had never existed, erased from the annals of history, in an attempt to bury the shame his rule had brought upon the empire. Heliogabalus' relationships with his advisors and the Senate. As we continue to dive deeper into the reign of Heliogabalus, it becomes clear that his relationship with the Senate and his advisors was one of growing tension and ultimate betrayal. While many emperors of Rome relied on their Senate for advice, support, and political guidance, Heliogabalus had little interest in traditional Roman politics. His focus was entirely on his personal desires, his religious obsessions, and indulging in extreme pleasures. This behavior caused an increasing disconnect between him and the Roman Senate, a body that had long played a critical role in maintaining the empire's stability. One of the most important duties of any emperor was to maintain alliances with the Senate, an institution that was made up of powerful men who had considerable influence over Rome's military and political decisions. But under Heliogabalus, this relationship began to crumble. Heliogabalus showed little respect for the Senate's authority. He frequently ignored their advice and mocked their attempts to assert control over the empire. He often made decisions on his own without consulting the Senate, which further alienated them. In fact, Heliogabalus made decisions that were so unpopular that it led to widespread discontent among Rome's elite. Many senators were particularly troubled by his blatant disregard for Roman traditions. Not only did Heliogabalus alienate the Senate with his actions, but he also made some incredibly rash and disrespectful decisions regarding Roman culture and history. Perhaps the most notable example of Heliogabalus' disrespect for Roman traditions was his decision to dress as a woman in public. This wasn't just an occasional thing. Heliogabalus regularly dressed in women's clothing and sometimes referred to himself as a goddess, demanding to be treated with the same reverence and authority as the divine figures in Roman mythology. This act of gender defiance was seen as a symbol of his complete rejection of the masculine virtues that were supposed to define a Roman emperor. Romans viewed their emperors as symbols of strength, leadership, and stability. Heliogabalus, on the other hand, rejected all of these ideals in favor of bizarre and decadent displays of self-indulgence. Such actions left the Senate and Roman citizens furious. They found themselves increasingly embarrassed by the emperor's behavior and began whispering among themselves that something needed to be done to rid Rome of such a disgraceful ruler. Heliogabalus' neglect of military affairs. The military, as mentioned earlier, played an indispensable role in the survival of the Roman Empire. Emperors were expected to prioritize military success and protection of the empire above all else. A strong military was the backbone of Roman power, and emperors who alienated their soldiers often paid the price. Heliogabalus, however, did not understand the importance of maintaining a good relationship with the army. While other emperors like Augustus or Trajan were praised for their military campaigns and leadership, Heliogabalus' interests lay far from the front lines. For Heliogabalus, the military was not something to be honored or respected. He had little interest in military strategy, and he ignored the crucial needs of the legions. His excessive spending on parties, religious rituals, and personal pleasures left little resources for the army. Meanwhile, he made no efforts to address the concerns of the soldiers, which led to growing dissatisfaction among the military ranks. The soldiers had been the key players in bringing him to power, but now they were beginning to question whether they had made a terrible mistake. One of the most significant issues was the lack of attention Heliogabalus gave to the empire's borders and defense. There were pressing concerns on Rome's frontiers, where barbarian groups were constantly testing the empire's defenses. Yet, instead of addressing these problems, Heliogabalus spent his time in luxurious banquets, religious ceremonies, and making highly publicized public appearances in which he would openly flaunt his wealth and eccentricity. His disdain for military's needs went so far that he even appointed his favorite charioteer, Hierocles, to a prominent position within his court, an act that insulted the seasoned military officers who had expected to receive the emperor's attention and trust. The promotion of someone with no military experience led to further tensions, as soldiers and generals alike began to feel abandoned. They started questioning his ability to lead them, and a sense of rebellion began to build. Heliogabalus' complete detachment from military matters became his downfall. Rome's soldiers were not interested in having an emperor who treated them as mere pawns in his lavish games. They wanted an emperor who understood the importance of Rome's security and who would respect their loyalty and sacrifices. Heliogabalus' paranoia and tyranny. As the pressure from his soldiers, advisors, and the Senate continued to mount, Heliogabalus began to grow paranoid. In response to increasing criticism, he became more tyrannical as behavior grew more erratic. He began to see enemies everywhere, even among his closest allies. He believed that anyone who opposed him was a threat to his rule, and this led him to make increasingly ruthless decisions. One of the first signs of Heliogabalus' growing paranoia was his treatment of his family members. His mother, Julia Suemias, had been a major influence on his rise to power, but she soon found herself caught in his web of suspicion. Heliogabalus' erratic behavior caused him to distrust even those who had helped him reach the throne, and his relationship with his mother became increasingly strained. Eventually, Julia Suemias was murdered alongside her son when the revolt against the emperor reached its peak. Heliogabalus also began to execute anyone who he believed was plotting against him, regardless of whether or not these suspicions were based on reality. He frequently purged his court of people he saw as threats, including both high-ranking officials and lowly servants. His erratic behavior caused many of his closest advisors to turn on him, knowing that their positions were precarious under his rule. This climate of fear and instability was felt across Rome, and soon the political environment became one of total distrust. Heliogabalus, rather than being a strong and respected emperor, became a figure of horror and confusion. He was no longer viewed as a youthful, innocent ruler he had once appeared to be. Instead, he was seen as a tyrant, paranoid, ruthless, and completely out of touch with the needs of the empire. The revolt and assassination of Heliogabalus. As Heliogabalus became more erratic and paranoid, the tension between him and his soldiers finally reached its breaking point. His failure to maintain the loyalty of the military, coupled with his increasingly reckless behavior, led to the eventual conspiracy that would bring about his downfall. In 222 AD, after just 4 years on the throne, the final plot to assassinate Heliogabalus came to fruition. His own Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers tasked with protecting the emperor, were the ones who carried out the assassination. After being struck down in his palace, Heliogabalus' body was dragged to the streets of Rome, humiliated and desecrated. The Senate, eager to remove the stain of Heliogabalus' reign from their history, declared that all traces of him should be erased. Statues of the emperor were smashed, his name was struck from official records, and his reign was declared an embarrassment to the Roman Empire. The Senate went so far as to erase his very existence, hoping that by doing so, they could restore Rome's honor and dignity. It's ironic, in a way, that Heliogabalus' reign, which had been so full of attention-grabbing excess and scandal, ended in such a quiet and systematic erasure. The emperor who had once been the center of attention, flashing his eccentricities to the Roman world, was now forgotten, erased from history as though he had never been. The story of Heliogabalus is one of the most bizarre and fascinating chapters in the history of the Roman Empire. His reign may have lasted only a few short years, but the chaos, scandal, and excess that followed him have ensured that his name will be remembered for centuries. From the moment he ascended the throne as a 14-year-old boy, it was clear that Heliogabalus was not going to follow the usual path of Roman emperors. Instead of being a figure of strength, military prowess, or wisdom, he was an emperor who seemed to live only for himself, indulging in luxury, eccentricities, and perversion. Heliogabalus' obsession with the sun god El-Gabal, his scandalous relationships, and his complete disregard for Roman traditions made him a target for ridicule and hatred. His lavish parties, where guests were smothered in rose petals, and his bizarre religious rituals alienated both the Senate and the people of Rome. The Roman military, which had once helped him rise to power, was left abandoned and disillusioned, as Heliogabalus paid little attention to the empire's defense or the needs of its soldiers. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of his reign was his utter disregard for people around him. While many emperors relied on their closest advisors, generals, and the Senate to keep the empire running smoothly, Heliogabalus did not trust anyone. He ruled through fear and whim, purging anyone he deemed a threat, and making enemies even of those who had once been loyal to him. His paranoia grew to such an extent that it ultimately led to his undoing. By the time the Praetorian Guard turned against him and carried out his assassination, Heliogabalus had already made himself a pariah in his own empire. His death was not just a political event. It was a symbolic end to a reign that had thrown Rome into chaos. The Senate, eager to erase all traces of this disgraceful emperor, ordered that his memory be completely obliterated. Statues of Heliogabalus were destroyed, his name was wiped from official records, and his reign was condemned to the dustbin of history. The empire, once again, was free of the madness that had consumed it during his time in power. So, what lessons can we draw from the story of Heliogabalus? His rise and fall offer us a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power in the hands of someone who is unfit to wield it. Heliogabalus was given the keys to the empire, but he didn't understand the responsibility that came with such power. Instead of using his position to serve the people and strengthen the empire, he used it to satisfy his own extravagant desires. The result? A reign marked by scandal, fear, and instability that ultimately led to his violent and humiliating downfall. It's easy to look at Heliogabalus and laugh at the absurdity of his behavior. His love for excess, his eccentricities, and his disregard for tradition make him an easy target for ridicule. But his story also forces us to reflect on the nature of power and leadership. What happens when a leader is disconnected from the needs and values of those they govern? What happens when power is abused by someone who doesn't understand the weight of their responsibilities? The fall of Heliogabalus reminds us that power, when wielded recklessly, can be self-destructive. In the end, Heliogabalus' reign was a brief, bizarre interlude in the history of the Roman Empire. His name may have been erased, but the lessons of his rule continue to resonate today. If you've enjoyed this wild and strange journey through history, don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the lives of some of the most fascinating figures from the past. There's always more to discover when we look beyond the surface and explore the darker, more unexpected parts of history. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning about the eccentric and unpredictable figures that shape the world we live in today. Heliogabalus' story is one that is as shocking as it is tragic. It serves as a reminder of how easily power can corrupt and how dangerous it is to ignore the needs of those who rely on you. The empire that had once been built on strength, discipline, and tradition was left teetering on the edge of chaos under his reckless rule. While Heliogabalus may have been erased from the historical record, his reign continues to remind us of the importance of leadership grounded in responsibility and respect for the values that sustain a civilization. His downfall is a powerful lesson in humility, accountability, and the consequences of self-indulgence.